online. If you can't hear anything, then I won't say anything more to you because you can't hear me. But if you can hear, that's fantastic. We've got about 145 people who have registered for the webinar, and obviously relatively small proportion of that total are already online. My name's Jim Tanburn. I'm coordinator of the DCED, and I'm just presiding, really. The substance of the webinar is from Adam Kessler, who's logged in as one of the DCEDs on your list of participants. Eleanor Bell is the other, and then Will Fairburn. We're missing the person who wrote the sample size calculator, who's doing his exams in Oxford at the moment. That's Richard. Coincidentally, also Richard Tanburn. I'm going to say a few introductory remarks before handing over to Adam, and welcome. Any time during this webinar, please type a question into the chat box, and we will try to answer it in the time we have. Meanwhile, this is the shape of the presentation: 5 minutes maximum on Donor Committee for Enterprise Development, 10 minutes on introduction to sampling, 10 minutes on the calculator, and then questions and answers with questions in the chat box, as I say. If you're joining on the phone, and I can see a couple of people have joined us on the phone, you haven't got a chat box, so try an email to any of us, that might work, or a Skype message. Anyway, welcome, and let's see. On the donor committee, this is a global forum of about 24 bilateral donors and UN agencies and a foundation looking at the effectiveness of private sector development in general and covering lots of different approaches. We have a huge website. Please visit it and use it and contribute to it. I won't say any more on that just now, except that we have a standard for results measurement, which is an 8-part framework for effective on-the-ground, so bottom-up results measurement to enable programs to be more effective. The driving force for it is people in the field wanting to be more effective in what they do, what you do. We reckon there's 100 and something programs using it at the moment, and it's certainly meeting a need as a framework for good practice. I'm assuming that most of you, if not all of you who are listening, are already familiar with the standard, so I won't say any more about it now, except that we had always thought, when we started on this journey with the standard in 2008, we rather assumed that there'd be large chunks of good measurement practice where we could refer people to other websites and resources for for normal bits of good measurement practice. What we found over the last few years is there are actually relatively few resources out there that are intended for non-specialists, so people in the field who are implementers and want to do some decent measurement, who are not statisticians or researchers, just getting stuff done, and want to know the basics of good measurement. So this sample size calculator and guidance that we're working on now, and which you've joined the webinar to hear more about, come in that category of being rules of thumb and relatively quick and easy ways to select sample sizes that are broadly better than just guessing, but wouldn't qualify as full academic rigor because you can't afford that and haven't got time for it and don't have the multiple degrees you would need to be able to do all that. So I wanted to frame this webinar as very much an introduction, essentially for non-specialists. We've had one or two very high-level specialists want to join, and where we've noticed that, we've said maybe this isn't the webinar for you. This is really entry-level. And we hope that it makes life simpler and easier and quicker and of better quality than it would otherwise have been. I'm going to hand over to Adam now to talk us through sampling and why we're having this webinar at all and why it's important. Adam.
Thanks, Jim. You need to give me the presentable Eleanor, then I can skip the slides. So just quickly to say that one of the questions we get asked most frequently in the DCED standard is, what sample size should I use? How good is good enough? And there's a huge range of kind of experience and opinions, ranging from programs doing samples with 2,000 people to programs going out and like talking to the first 10 people they run across. So one of the motivations behind this sample size guidance was to try and provide some more guidance and provide simple rules of thumb that programs could use without a strong statistical background. I'm now going to hand over to Will, who will talk us through the guidance itself and some basic principles of sampling, and then I'll go through the sample size calculator.
Thanks. So I'm giving just a basic overview of sampling. So first looking at what is sampling. Next, what are the kind of key initial considerations of sampling? And then looking at three of the most popular sampling techniques. So simple random sampling, stratified sampling, and cluster sampling. As Richard mentioned, this guide is pitched at those doing quick and cheap sampling rather than more rigorous and more complicated. So I'll be keeping it quite basic. So the three most important things to remember in sampling. Firstly, the population. This is the target group of your research, the group you want to ultimately find out about and answer some research question on. So for example, all farmers using an enhanced seed that you've given them and you're interested in if this changes the yields. The sampling is the selection of a subset from this population in such a way as to represent the population characteristics, as clearly it would be far too expensive and impractical to measure the entirety of the population. And the final fundamental of sampling is bias, and the key to good sampling is avoiding bias. Bias is where your sample is systematically different from the population. So looking at the diagram, if your population was 60% younger farmers and 40% older farmers, but you only asked the older farmers, this would miss all the younger farmers and your results would be biased towards that. So the point of sampling is, with sampling we can avoid collecting data on everyone in the population, since we only need to analyse a cleverly drawn subset, i.e. our sample, and then we can generalise these results to the entire population as long as the sample isn't biased. Now, there are a lot of factors that you need to consider before collecting your sample, because the sample size varies with so many different elements. So firstly, the research elements. You need a tightly defined population of what you want to analyse. Secondly, what is the purpose of the research? Do you want to go for an average of some characteristic, or is your aim to compare two groups? And finally, do you want to perform subgroup analysis? That's also called disaggregating the data. If you want to examine how results vary between gender or between old and young, that has to be decided before you collect your sample. You can't then just go back and analyse a previously collected sample for that. There's also a number of practical considerations. How robust the results you need will impact the sampling, because the more robust you'll need, likely the bigger sample that will require. The context from which you collect your sample will also vary the sample size. I think Adam's going to go into that later. And finally, the factors that contribute to more robust results, such as a high level of precision, will require higher sample sizes and likely more complicated techniques, and thus more expensive. So having a good understanding of your budget and what you want to get out of your sample is critical. Just the key takeaway from this slide is having a great understanding of what you want to do before you go collect your sample, because it will be too late often after. So, the first of our basic sampling techniques is simple random sampling. This is the most basic form of sampling. The only requirement is each individual has an equal chance of being selected. And by taking the sample randomly, that means there'll be no bias on average. Whereas if there are unequal chances of selection, that would bias the result. Visually, that's represented by numbering these icons and then randomly selecting certain numbers to create our sample. Our next sampling technique is stratified sampling. This is used where you think some characteristic, which we'll call a strata of the population, will have an important impact on the result. So with the random sampling we just looked at, there is a chance your sample will not adequately represent the population in terms of some characteristic. For example, you think gender is really important in determining the crop yields of your seeds, the gender of your farmers, yet by some bad luck, your sample came back with an inadequate number of women for your sample to represent that. So stratified sampling corrects this by being a random sample from a given strata, i.e. you've guaranteed the strata is represented in the sample. Visually, this is seen by showing different strata in different colours, and then within each of those strata, randomly selecting to create a sample. And this is going to lead to a higher sample size requirement normally. Our final basic sampling technique is cluster sampling. This is used where you're limiting your ability to collect data across the whole population. So for example, keeping going with our crop yields, imagine you want to look at that across a really wide geography, across loads of villages across the region, and then you randomly select where you need to go to collect that data. That entails a huge amount of travelling and likely be pretty impractical. So a cheaper alternative to that is cluster sampling. This is where you take clusters of the population, such as they're already being divided into villages. Then, having got these clusters, you randomly select some of these, and then within these clusters, you then randomly sample. So basically, we see our population of these icons numbered 1 to 12, and we can imagine this being in 6 villages. Out of these 6 villages, we randomly select 2 of them, and then within those 2, we then sample. This requires a higher sample size again to account for the fact that you might have people within villages being more similar. So just to clarify the difference between cluster and stratified sampling, cluster sampling is when our population is already broken into groups, i.e. clusters, and each cluster represents the population. Thus, we can get away with selecting fewer clusters and saving ourselves travelling across the whole region. Whereas in stratified sampling, the population is split into groups by some characteristic which we think impacts the results. Now run through a quick example of how we might do this. So imagine we've got a region comprised of 16 villages. We don't want to travel across the entire region, so we randomly select 4 of these 6, taking a list of the 16 and randomly selecting. Next, in order to understand how results differ by gender, we might choose to use stratified sampling. So we decide that when we sample, we want 50% male and 50% female. So consequently, within each of the 4 villages, with the list of inhabitants, we randomly select 10 men and 10 women from each, giving a total sample of 80. So just to run through the conclusions of this slide. The key thing for sampling is to avoid bias. If you avoid bias, you've got a great sample and you can infer results reliably for the population. Secondly, as you've seen, there's loads of things that impact the sample size, and these need to be decided and worked out beforehand, and then you need to collect the sample, rather than deciding later that you want to analyse something or other in your given sample. And finally, we've looked at some of the basic sampling strategies, which can hopefully help you create a more representative and a more efficient sample. Thanks.
Great. Thanks a lot, Will. Could you please give... Oh, I've got the presentable. Brilliant. Okay. So, yes, thanks a lot for that. Just a reminder for anyone who's got their video turned on, could you please turn it off because nice as this is to see you, it uses up bandwidth and it makes it harder to hear, I think. So I'm going to introduce the sample size calculator. This is an online tool which we've developed to help programs using the standard to select a minimum sample size for quantitative surveys. And there's a full guidance note accompanying it on the website. So what's the point of a sample size calculator? It can suggest a minimum sample size based on assumptions about your sample. And this is really important. This minimum sample size doesn't come out of nowhere, but it's based on assumptions both about the research you want to conduct and also about the population group you're looking at. Secondly, it shows how these assumptions affect the sample size and vice versa. So for example, if you have budget limitations and you can only have a certain number of people in your sample, you can use this calculator to say, what does that mean about the statements I can make about this research? What does it mean about the precision of the research? But a sample size calculator is only one tool, and it can't tell you what assumptions to make. You need to kind of work this out for yourself. It also can't make up for a biased sample or poorly conducted research. So using a sample size calculator is not a guarantee that you will have good research, it's just one of the inputs into it. It's also worth saying that, as Jim stated at the beginning, because the sample size calculator was designed as a simple tool to use without statistical expertise, it's not as robust as getting a full statistician to do a more complex assessment, so it has limitations. And I'm going to talk about two kinds of study you might want to do. The first one is a descriptive study. This is where you just want to find out the characteristics of a population. Let's say you're researching maize in an African country. You want to find out about yields of maize farmers. This is a descriptive study. A comparative study, by contrast, is where you want to compare two different groups. And there are two types of comparative study. You might want to compare two separate groups, say people who received and people who did not receive an intervention. Or you might want to compare one group at 2 points in time. So this is a simple before-after study. You're comparing a group of people before an intervention to after an intervention. And the sample size calculator can do both, but in this talk we're just going to focus on the former, assuming you want to compare two different groups. So let's start with a descriptive study. And as discussed, we're going to look at a descriptive study of maize yields in, let's say, Malawi. I'm going to run through the different things you need to know, and each of these are things which you need to input into the sample size calculator in order to get an understanding of the sample size. And so the first thing is the range. And the range, as you might remember from your GCSE statistics or your high school statistics, is the difference between the highest value and the lowest value in a sample. Obviously, you don't know what the range in your sample is before you do it, so you need to estimate it, maybe drawing on the expertise of people in your team to try and find out what the range is likely to be. And bear in mind, it's not the absolute highest and the absolute lowest value that will ever occur. You just want the highest value and lowest value which are likely to occur. To be precise, the highest and lowest value that will occur 95% of the time. Just intuitively, the reason the range is important is that a bigger range indicates a bigger variance, bigger variability in your study. And the bigger the variability, the bigger sample size you need, because the more difference there is between different people. If you imagine that the range was effectively 0, so that everyone had exactly the same answer to your question, you only need to ask one person the question in order to know what everyone else's answer will be, because it's the same. But if the range is massive, then the amount of information you get from any single interview will be correspondingly less. Okay, let's go for margin of error. This is the second thing you'll need to enter into your sample size calculator, and this is an estimate of how precisely you can estimate the true average of the population. So in other words, it helps you to estimate how close you are to the true population average based on your sample data. So when you do a study, your study will give you an average for your sample, and you want to know, is this average for my sample similar to the overall population? The margin of error is a way of quantifying it. And to be precise, the margin of error when subtracted and or added to the sample average, gives you the range of values in which the true population average is likely to fall. The confidence level is a related variable. This is how confident you want to be in the answer. And to be precise, it's how confident you want to be that the true population average falls between the margins of error. These two concepts are confused, so I'm going to give an example. If you have a confidence level of 95%, an average of 10, and a margin of error of 2, this allows you to be 95% certain, which is your confidence level, that the true value of the population lies between 8 and 12, which is the average plus or minus the margin of error. So this is the difference between the two. And finally, population. You enter in the size of the total population from which you're sampling. And obviously, the bigger the population, the bigger sample. But in practice, it doesn't tend to make a huge difference below a fairly low level. Increasing the size of the population doesn't make a big difference to your sample size. So I'm going to talk through the different fields in the calculator and look at how you can enter data into these fields to get a useful answer. So as we said, we're doing a descriptive study. We want to know about maize yields. Let's say we go and we ask our agronomist in the team, and he tells us that the highest and lowest values are likely to be around 1/4 of a tonne per hectare and 4 tonnes per hectare. So this is the range. This will also give us the variability in the data. Obviously, we don't actually know this yet, but we need to have some kind of assumption we can do in order to work out the sample size. The margin of error here, we've chosen as 1/4 of a tonne per hectare. This means that if our assumptions hold true, our sample average will be precise. It will reflect the true population average to within 1/4 of a tonne, more or less. Selected a 90% confidence level. Confidence levels are normally 90% or 95%. And a population size of 20,000. And here the sample size calculator gives you a minimum sample size of 39. It's maybe worth thinking for a second, what would happen if we changed these values? If the range was bigger, this would indicate greater variation in your sample, and so this would require a greater sample size in order to get the same precision. If the margin of error was smaller, this would require a more precise survey. So if our margin of error was 0.1 instead of 0.25, it would mean that the true population average is likely to be closer to the sample average, and so this would require a larger sample. And a higher confidence level would also require a larger sample. So let's look quickly at a comparative study. So for a comparative study, this is a study where you're comparing two different groups, and we're kind of assuming the case where you are comparing a group who hasn't had the treatment with a group who has had the treatment, for the sake of argument. So in this case, we want to look at the range. Obviously, you have two groups, so you only select the range for one of them. So let's give the range for the baseline group, and the difference between the highest and lowest value that is likely to occur, the same as before. The next concept, this is the only real way in which this varies from a descriptive study. We need to enter the minimum detectable difference. And this is the smallest difference between two groups that you want to be able to detect in your study. The intuition here is that if you are only interested in detecting massive differences in the variable, you actually need quite a small sample. Let's say you only want to detect a quadrupling of yield. Anything less is of no interest to you. You don't need a big sample to detect a quadrupling of yield because it's such a big change. You could, even if you have 10 people and one group has consistently 4 times as much yield as the other group, it's a fairly clear sign there's an important difference between them. But the smaller the difference that you want to be able to detect in your study, the higher sample size you need, because the harder it is to detect a small difference. Then the confidence level, as before, this is how confident you want to be in the answer. We go 90% or 95%, and the size of the total population from which you're sampling on. These are the 4 variables to enter in. So let's look at how this looks in the calculator. You can see in the top field I've selected comparative research, and again I've gone to my agronomist, asked what the likely range of yield is, and he said it is likely to be between 1/4 of a tonne per hectare and 4 tonnes per hectare. we decide that the minimum detectable difference is going to be 1/3 of a ton. In other words, if it's less than 1/3 of a ton per hectare, we're not that bothered in detecting it. Maybe we think that if we boost yield by less than 1/3 of a ton per hectare, we haven't really made much of a difference to farmers' lives, so we're not that bothered if we don't manage to report it. And as before, I go for a 90% confidence level and a population size of 20,000. And this gives a minimum sample size per population of 54. But remember that now we have two populations to look at. The first population is our baseline, our kind of initial group. The second population is our treatment group, because we're comparing two groups. So our minimum sample size per population is 54, but our total minimum sample size is 108, because we need to take a sample of 54 from the baseline group and a sample of 54 from our treatment group. So as you can see, the calculator offers a range of reasonably simple questions which can hopefully be answered by most programs, which at the end will give you a minimum sample size. And I guess one of the key points I'd like you to take away from this talk is that sample size choices include trade-offs. So past a certain point, a smaller sample size is not necessarily a bad thing, but it restricts what you can do in your analysis. And maybe the clearest way in which this is so is that you can do less subgroup analysis. All of the numbers that this sample size calculator gives you is for a particular group of people. But let's say your sample size calculator tells you 80 people is the minimum sample size, given your assumptions, and then you decide you want to disaggregate by male and female. If you have an equal split of male and female in your group, then you'll only have 40 males and 40 females, and so your sample of 40 will not be as, it's not as many as your initial sample of 80. If you want to analyze males with the same level of precision that you originally wanted to analyze the whole group, you will need to double your sample size. So you get a sample size just of males of 80. This can lead to very large samples. There's a study I recently worked on which had a sample size of just over 2,000, and the reason for this is that they were analyzing 6 different distinct population groups, and this required the sample size to be multiplied by 6 in order to get the same level of robustness. You can also, a smaller sample size can also lead to a less precise survey. In other words, your margins of error can increase. This means that the bounds within which you think the true population average falls will be increased, and you can be less confident in your results. So you can reduce the confidence level from 95% to 90%. But bear in mind that beyond a point, sample sizes will be too small to be credible for quantitative analysis. In the sample size calculator, we've set this at 30, so it won't give you it won't allow you to, or it won't recommend a minimum sample size of less than 30 per group. Okay, so for more information, you can go to enterprisedevelopment.org. If you follow these links down through the menu system, you go to measuring results, DCED standard for results measurement, and then the sample size calculator, you'll be able to see and use the calculator itself. And you can also download the guidance, which explains firstly how to use it, secondly gives more examples, and thirdly goes in more detail into the principles of sample size development that Will was describing earlier. In the sample size calculator, you'll also see blue links next to each field, and if you click on these, you'll see a short description of each field and an associated example. So thank you very much. I think we will now go to questions.
Adam, thank you so much. We have probably about half the people who signed up for the webinar have managed to join, and we've had several emails from people who could only join late because of technical difficulties or haven't joined at all. So if you think, well, first of all, we should be able to put a recording of the whole hour online today or tomorrow, but if you think it would be helpful to run the webinar again for any reason or would like a follow-up, do let us know. In the meantime, let me go back to Will with a question from Patrick Gallagher. How do you adjust the sample size when using a cluster sampling technique? Will?
Sure. So in the guide that we've put online, we suggest a rule of thumb by inflating the sample that would otherwise be by the simple random sampling technique by 20%. The reason for this is when we cluster the sample, this decreases the reliability of the sample due to the fact it's quite likely that people living in the same cluster tend to be homogeneous or to have more similar characteristics. So this is reducing the ability of our sample to represent the population. So yeah, if we inflate the sample by 20%, that would deal with that.
Excellent, thank you. We have a question from Halima Rahman. How shall we select the margin of error? Yes. Well, it quite depends how accurate you want to be, Adam. I don't know if you want to say anything on that.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right, Jim. So there are a couple of rules of thumb. One which is commonly used is to use a margin of error of 10% of the expected average of the sample. And the sample size calculator based on your range will tell you what the expected average is likely to be. So 10% works, 5% is used for more rigorous scientific studies. But I think Jim's right to say that it really depends on how accurate you need the data to be. So think about how much inaccuracy matters. Is there an issue if your sample misrepresents the real population average? And by how much kind of misrepresentation are you prepared to take in exchange for a small sample size?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think the point here is that everyone wants lots of rigor and accuracy. People usually don't appreciate how much it costs to be really precise. Precision costs money, and usually we're compromising in the real world. Adam, we have another question from Suprahatin Bosa. What's the best strategy to select a sample design with limited funding, which rather speaks to the question that we were just touching on. But Adam, I don't know if you can expand at all on what happens if you don't have enough money to do what you'd like to do.
Yeah, I think it's a great question and really important for most organizations using the standard, which rely generally on quite small, quite kind of low-cost techniques. So the first thing to note is that sample size is only one of the determinants of the cost of a study, and I wanted to quickly list a couple of other useful factors to look at. One of them is to potentially simplify the evaluation design. In other words, to reduce the number of groups you collect data on, not using a control group, or reducing the number of times you collect data. So taking an n-line study without a baseline or doing a retrospective baseline. Another thing you might look at doing is clarifying your information needs. So looking to see if you're collecting information that you don't need to, checking that you really need every question in your questionnaire. You can also try and use existing data. So using secondary data is normally cheaper because someone else has already done the data collection exercise. So for quantitative data, you could look at existing surveys or information from other project records. And finally, you can try to reduce the cost of data collection, which can be done, for example, by changing the technique. Observation might cost less than surveys, or the way you collect the data. So phone interviews might be cheaper than face-to-face interviews, and using something like university students can be a good low-cost data collection technique. So I think those are the non-sample size related ways to reduce your budget, to reduce the costs. Another thing you can do, I guess as we talked about in the last slide, is to do less subgroup analysis. So if you do less subgroup analysis, you can reduce your sample size and reduce your costs. You can accept a reduced precision and a reduced confidence level, which is one way to, which means that your study, I guess, is less robust, but it's cheaper. And finally, you can look at using cluster sampling. So one of the benefits of cluster sampling is that it reduces travel times. If you did simple random sampling over a large population, you'll probably find your enumerators going out in all directions, which is really expensive. But by using cluster samples, you mean each enumerator only visits one village and does all their interviewing there. So that's another way to do data collection on a budget.
Adam, thank you. Very good. Question from Pushpa Lal. Should we have difference in estimating the sample size for treatment group and control group, or should we have equal number of sample size for treatment and control groups? Will, do you want to pick that one?
Sure. The answer is simply keep equal sizes for your treatment group and your control group.
Okay, that was short.
Can I add to that?
Yes, please.
Yes. So Will is completely correct that if you want your highest statistical power, then the answer is to keep them both the same. But there is another complication, which is programs are often more interested in finding out about their treatment group than their control group, because the treatment group is the one which they actually involved in the program. So for some programs, they do end up taking a larger number of samples from the treatment group precisely for that reason. Another approach might be to keep the number of samples the same, but make the questionnaire different. So often from your control group, you'll just want a couple of very basic questions to get the data which you compare to your treatment group. But from the treatment group, you want a larger amount of data in order to understand how they've used the intervention, how they feel about it, whether they're likely to continue using it, and so on.
Okay, very good. We've got another question which is anonymous, or I don't know who asked it. Working in small island states, we often have a very small population. Is there a rule of thumb for the smallest sample ever? Hard to answer. I don't know, Adam, Will, you want to pick up on that?
Will, do you want to say something?
Again, it depends on what you want to look at. You can get away with quite a small sample, maybe as small as kind of approximately 30, but it really depends on the other factors like how confident you want to be, what margin of error. If you're willing to tolerate quite low levels of precision and confidence, the calculator will come back with a lower answer. So the smaller you can make those, the smaller your sample we can get away with.
Yeah, I think that's right. And if obviously, if it depends kind of how small your population size is, but if it's, for example, less than 30, then say it's a business working with 15 contract farmers, it's you just go out and interview all of those 15. You're not sampling in that case, you're just interviewing the whole population.
Okay, let's take a question to Will from Jackie Yiptong Avila. How do you select a sample in the absence of a frame? Maybe explain what a frame is first and then give us a few options.
Sure. So a sampling frame is a list of all the items or people forming the population from which you're then going to take the samples. So that's where you can randomly select from. So the best option would be you had a list of everyone in the village, and then you randomly select from that, but clearly you're not always going to have that. So one common strategy that I've seen used is to do it by maps. So either you've got a map of the area, or you've got an aerial photo, or in Google Maps with the region that you're interested in, and then you create a sampling frame out of this via the coordinates of your houses. And from this you create a list, and then when you've done that, you can then randomly select from it. Another option is something called systematic sampling, which isn't ideal, but it's a compromise for the real world. And this would be where you go to, for example, every third house as you walk along the street. It's slightly problematic if you thought that you're missing something important by doing that, but that's a common technique for dealing with the absence of a full list of the population.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Adam, we've got a question from Stephen Hindle of KSLP. I'm interested in Malawi small business owners' thoughts about the challenges facing their businesses, particularly what they rank as the top 3 challenges. Can I use this DCD approach to determine minimum sample size?
Great. Thanks a lot. I'm told I've been a bit quiet so far, so apologies if you haven't heard me. I'm speaking up now. So yeah, thanks for the question. The first question is whether it's more appropriate for you to use a quantitative or qualitative approach. So if you are using if you want to understand what business owners think about the challenges facing their business, it might be more appropriate to use a primarily qualitative approach, which wouldn't use this kind of DCED sample size calculator. But if you want quantitative data, in other words, you want a quantitative summary of what they rank as the top 3 challenges, then you can use this approach. Your population would probably be Malawi small businesses, so ideally you would be able to get a list of small businesses, possibly from some kind of government agency. You would then, I guess, sample from them from that list using simple random sampling would be the easiest approach.
Okay, do you want to take Lindsay McCall's question as well? Is the calculator also useful for qualitative analysis?
Yeah, I
think you sort of answered it.
Well, no, that works quite nicely. So its simple answer is no, it's not useful for qualitative analysis. It's just useful for quantitative analysis. But sample size for qualitative analysis is also important. And so I wanted to just really quickly discuss a couple of possible techniques. So one which is commonly used is called convenience sampling, which is just to go to wherever is convenient to find whoever's around. It's not the ideal way of sampling, but it is possible. Another one is called maximum variation sampling, and this is when you try to select respondents who will give you a range of different answers in the dimensions of interest. So in the previous case of Malawian small business owners, this might include a mix of male and female owners because they would have different challenges. It might include a mixture of local and expat business owners, or whatever other people you think will give you interesting and different answers. I'll just go for 2 more techniques. One is called sampling contrasting cases, and this is where you get 2 population groups with distinct characteristics. For example, if you're trying to encourage farmers to adopt a new technology, you might get a group of farmers who have adopted it and a group of farmers who haven't, and then you can try to explore what are the differences between these groups which mean that one did and one didn't adopt it. And finally, and most commonly used, is snowball sampling. And this is perhaps the most common sampling method. You start by identifying a couple of individuals who are relevant to the study, for example, farmers using a new technology, and you then ask each respondent to give you more suggestions for more people who meet your criteria. So it's called snowball. It's like a snowball rolling down a hill. It gets bigger as it goes. So yeah, those are a couple of qualitative sampling techniques.
Okay, thank you. We've got a question from Bodia Wijaya Mulya. How to do cluster random sampling? Do you have any suggestion what software we should use? I think in general we try to avoid suggesting software, mainly because people tend to resort to software before fully understanding what the need is, and you know, in other words, it can be a bit of a shortcut to sort of thinking through the underlying assumptions and so on. But the how to do cluster random sampling, would Adam or Will, do you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, I guess in line with the aim to make a sample size calculator which is accessible without kind of detailed knowledge, you should be able to do most of what you need to do in Excel, really. So Excel has a random function. You type equals RAND, open brackets, close brackets, and you can use this just to select randomly from a list of clusters. So you would put all of your clusters on the list, use the random function to randomly select some. I'm not sure you would necessarily need more than that, but yeah.
Excellent. Will, do you want to add to that?
No, I think that was very well explained. There shouldn't be a need to use too much software, I think, for the class sampling.
Yeah,
as well.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. From a question from Nabin Kumar Khanna for Adam, I think. How do you select sample size in a challenge fund project where the outreach coverage is very large? I think that's a very good question. When your portfolio is spread across the planet, how do you do that?
Great. Yep, it is a really good question. And I think one thing which we've talked about is that the population doesn't actually make a huge difference past a certain point. So if we use a couple of assumptions at the margin of error of 5 in a range of 0 to 100, a population of 200 people would give a sample size of 51, but a population of 20,000 gives a sample size of 68. So although you are multiplying your population by a factor of 100, your sample size only really increases by 17 people. So the size of the population itself doesn't make a huge difference to the sample size, but it does make a difference to the logistics and the challenges of kind of moving around and sending enumerators to a larger population. And this is where it's important to cluster. So rather than try to randomly sample from the whole population, select clusters. This can be villages, for example, and then visit a small number of villages which you want to sample from.
Thank you, thank you. We've got quite a few questions about how to decide what the margin of error is. I think it's really hard to answer that. I mean, if you're not quite sure about the question, then the answer is probably 90% rather than 95%. But that's just it really depends what accuracy you're going for or what accuracy you can afford. Will, you have an example, if it's helpful?
Sure, this is just picking up on Stephen Hindle's question, saying, how do I set the minimum and maximum values, again, quantitative sampling? So this is just to run through, this is what Adam was saying before, where an easy way to select your range is you imagine where you think the data is going to fall, or 95% of the data. So we go for height of men in the UK, say, and we're thinking about where do you think the height would that be? You know, we'd probably think it would be about 6'4", maybe 6'5", for 95% of the population. And at the lower end, we'd maybe say 5'6", 5'5". And then when we put that data into the sample calculator, that'll create our range, and we'll come back with an appropriate confidence level from that, just to give a worked example.
Okay, thanks. That's fantastic. We've got a question from Sarah W. Does this sampling calculation tool only apply to calculating averages? What are the implications of more sophisticated statistical analysis like correlations?
Yeah,
Adam, do you want to take that?
Sure. The simple answer is that the sample size calculator, I guess, was designed for programs which, in my experience, really don't do a high level of sophisticated statistical techniques. So it's primarily designed for programs who are just looking at averages and maybe comparisons. If you are looking at correlations, for example, hopefully you'll have a few people with statistical experience on your team who might be able to guide you through the process in more depth.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. We're really not claiming to be a substitute or replacement for expert statisticians, and there's lots of them around, and if you're in serious doubt, you should hire one and you know, get stuck into the technical detail. This is really intended as a series of rules of thumb of around statistics that can help you to get up and running with, as I say, better than just guessing, but not as good as serious statistics. So it's somewhere in between, and that seems to be a gap. You know, it would be easy to blind you with science and lots of formulae, but we're trying to find a way that's not that advanced, but also not simplistic to the point of being meaningless. Adam, Will, do you want to make any final comments? Because we're coming up to the hour now. Been a very lively discussion. We haven't had any other questions that I think we can readily address.
No final no final questions, comments from me, but I'll just encourage people to have a look at the website, and if you have any comments on the clarity of the calculator, please send them to us, and also if you have any requests for additional features, we're thinking of maybe revising it at some point in the future.
Will, any final comment?
Nothing more for me. I thought that was some really good questions.
Yes, great questions. Thank you very much for sending them in. We hope that you'll use the guidance and the calculator, and if and when you do and you have questions, email us and we will do our best to answer them. We've probably only scratched the surface in this hour, but at least we've made a start. And again, to be honest, we were expecting about 10 people to sign up for this webinar, and I think, as I say, we've got about 150, so it's clearly a need out there, and we're keen to support you in any way that's practical to get to where you need to get to. So we look forward to hearing more from you, particularly your experience in using this set of supporting instruments, and your needs, as Will says or Adam says, for further input and support. Thank you all for joining. Thank you especially to Will and Adam for doing everything, and thank you for the feedback that we've also got privately. That it seems to have been a good hour. So at this point, I will declare the webinar closed, and we will be in touch. Goodbye for now.